The following video will contain spoilers for the entirety of the Stanley Parable mod and its 2013 remake. If you have not played either of the games, I highly recommend that you stop now and give one of them a try, as even knowing the premise for them spoils a lot of the experience.
There was nothing here. No choice to make, no path to follow, just an empty broom closet. No reason to still be here. It was baffling that Stanley was still just sitting in the broom closet. He wasn't even doing anything. At least if there was something to interact with, he'd be justified in some way. As it is, he's literally just standing there doing sweet FA.
The Stanley Parable originally released as a mod for the Source game engine in July of 2011, developed by Davey Redden. He has gone on record saying that he is directly inspired by the Metal Gear Solid series, Portal, Braid, and Bioshock among others, and how they all encourage the player to stop and consider the possibility of an unreliable narrator, and whether they are just doing what they're told to do, or if they actually have a reason to fight. The original mod does not differ too strongly from the tongue-in-cheek titled re-release, the Stanley Parable HD Remix. The core concept, layout of the map, and many of its alternate paths remain exactly the same. The main reason one would buy the remix version is for the updated graphics and some small additional endings. One notable omission of the remix is being teleported to an actual Half-Life 2 level, which is now replaced with the more topical inclusion of Minecraft, as well as the intro to Portal 1. One could argue that the Stanley Parable would never have even been made if it were not for the creation of the original Dear Esther mod back in June of 2008. This paved the way for some more experimental, standalone, story-focused mods for the Source engine. Dear Esther was also additionally released in February 2012 in a standalone remake on Steam, testing the waters for this sort of re-release. After the word-of-mouth success of the original Stanley Parable mod, Redden began working on the remake with Willem Pugh. Even though Dear Esther received many mixed reviews, the sales were decent enough to prove that a remake of the Stanley Parable could probably also be financially viable. The HD remix was released under the game developer, Galactic Cafe, who isn't really known for anything but the Stanley Parable as of the making of this video, aside from some small side projects. Right from the title screen, it is immediately visible what kind of game the player is in for. A fourth wall breaking, sarcastic, unconventional experience. Showing the player what they are in for before they even begin to play is the sign of a great title screen. The game begins with a simple, brief introduction from a witty and humorous British narrator played by Kevin Brighton. Stanley has a 9-to-5 day job of pressing various keys when his computer tells him to, when suddenly all of the people in his building vanish, prompting him to begin a search for the truth. The player then gains control of Stanley and can choose whether or not to trust the narrator or rebel against him, leading to various humorous and sometimes tense situations. The first moment that such choices are immediately apparent to the player is when they soon come upon a set of two doors that are both open, and the narrator states that Stanley took the left one. This moment in particular is probably the most memorable event in the entire game because it is the first click in the player's brain that they have not only a choice in what should be a straightforward walking simulator, but that they will also be challenging the narrator, becoming distrustful of him. Even though there are some choices beforehand that the player can make to challenge the narrator, like jumping out of an open window or closing the door and not even leaving the office in the first place, they are only achievable once the player actually gains the knowledge that they can actively fight what is essentially the game's god. While the gameplay is just a walking simulator, it is actually one of the few walking simulators that I have completely enjoyed. A walking simulator is a game in which the main way the player interacts is by walking through environments, taking in the story around them. There is a focus on narrative, rather than gameplay, and as a result, walking simulators tend to be on the short side of things. This genre fits the Stanley Parable very well. The longest ending there is in the game is roughly 15 minutes from start to end. Being bogged down with gameplay would make the game incredibly boring and repetitive, even with the ability to save at any time. A feature allowing the player to load a game from the pause menu would have also been very nice, as the only way to load a save file is to actually quit out to the main menu, causing for more immersion-breaking experiences than there should have been. The developers once considered the idea of having an ending where the player would be stuck and the only way to continue would be an option in the pause menu, only able to be found when the players paused the game with the intent to restart it or load up another save file. This didn't bode well in playtesting, so they took it out. It's a shame because that would have been a really clever moment, like finding a piece of a picture in PT in the pause menu, except more fair. It's also a bit confusing why they ended up not including that feature in the game, because many of the endings are incredibly vague in how you activate them. The developer obviously has a lot of faith in how the player will experiment with what they can interact with, because a lot of endings are a result of doing things not immediately obvious, like interacting with various computers throughout the game in a certain order, or unplugging a phone instead of answering it. One of the endings even forces the player to completely restart from the pause menu even after Stanley gets killed. Early on in development, the creators considered having a flowchart showing the various endings and where the different paths diverge. Fortunately, playtesters did not respond very favorably to having this knowledge ahead of time, as this really would have hindered the experience. There are 19 different endings to the game, each of them original and ending in an entirely different way. Each one of them usually brings up a different idea of game design that most people will never stop to think about, like video games being art, or the struggles game designers have with players usually intentionally wanting to break their games. However, most of these topics are unfortunately just skimmed over. Right when the game approaches a topic about something really interesting, the narrator simply makes a one-off joke about the topic, and then quickly moves on to focusing about something else. That is not to say that the game tries incredibly hard to constantly be humorous, however. One of the game's strengths is actually the restraint to not go over the top in its humorous atmosphere. The most absurd the game ever gets is teleporting Stanley to a heaven where he presses buttons for all eternity, or watching a picture of a baby catch fire.
You heartless bastard.
They probably had the opportunity to turn the game into a constant stream of jokes coming left and right from the narrator, but they didn't. The Stanley Parable does get fairly serious sometimes too, having endings where the narrator actually becomes attached to Stanley and gets sad when the player dies, not angry as he usually does. The game repeatedly brings up the idea that game creators and game players are almost always at war with each other, with the narrator obviously representing the auteur or developer of the game, and the player/Stanley being the consumers. The ending where the player follows everything the narrator tells them to do is actually the happiest one. It's the most satisfying and the only one with an actual true ending. Although the narrator can seem hostile from time to time, he is not GLaDOS from Portal. He actually just wants to bring Stanley, or the player, along for a small ride and make their day better. But sometimes the player wants to test the game's limits. Everyone has had those moments where they wanted to see if a developer actually went through the effort of putting in a lot of detailed objects behind a wall, or test how far off the beaten path the player can walk before they are blocked off.
You see? There's nothing here. I haven't even finished building this section of the map, because you were never supposed to be here in the first place.
This idea of players challenging the game designer is shown basically throughout the entire game. When a game makes it obvious that the player should continue down the left door, the player regularly goes down the right door. Sometimes it's to find secrets and other items, sometimes it's to actually challenge the creator, and sometimes it's out of pure curiosity, with no real reason at all. And this aggravates developers. They have to put up with gamers wanting to look behind every single corner, so they have to make sure everything looks completely perfect. And sometimes it's the opposite. When the game developer has something really cool to show the player that they worked really long and hard on, like a big explosion, the player could be looking at the completely wrong direction, poking their head around, wasting all that hard work. There are a lot of situations like this in the Half-Life series, since your viewpoint is never actually restricted. These moments are represented in the broom closet in the Stanley Parable. The player can spend an extremely long time in the broom closet with the door shut. There's actually nothing of interest in the broom closet at all, and the narrator even mocks the player for waiting in there for so long because they are missing out on the experience that the narrator has crafted for them. The game developer can also just be sad, not angry at the player for missing out on that experience. Sometimes the player does random things to try to break the game. In the ending where the player sees a beautiful starscape, and the narrator is truly happy and at peace with Stanley, the player can decide to kill themselves by repeatedly jumping off of a tall staircase. There is no reason for the player to do this. The narrator reacts with confusion and disbelief that Stanley/the player would even want to kill themselves when they could be looking at such a great starscape with so many stars, abstract shapes, and trance-inducing music. One of the more topical issues that the game has is the game's art discussion. One of the paths has the player ranking their satisfaction with the game to the narrator. If given a low score, he goes off on how the player isn't having fun because it's not artsy enough. He then offers the player a chance to play a new game that he made, where the player has to repeatedly press a button to stop a baby from crawling into a fire, which represents the futility and the struggle that families feel when raising a child. If the player doesn't understand it, then they are at fault because they do not understand its heavy artistic message. Afterwards, the player is then teleported into an emulation of Minecraft, where the narrator creates a small, crude house, touting his artistic creativity. Before long, the narrator switches the area to the first level of Portal 1. At this point, it becomes less of a clever reference with an intent to send a message, and more of a, hey, look, it's that game you like, isn't that funny? Pandering sort of thing without much of a point. The Portal 1 reference feels a bit shoehorned in, especially after already having the Minecraft one. In the original mod, the Half-Life 2 level made it more sense at least because it was actually based off of that game originally. With discussions about various video games' artistic merit becoming more and more prevalent over the years, it is somewhat rare to find a middle ground in these talks. Either the player says the game isn't artistic enough, or the players say that the game is too artistic and pretentious. Ironically, my main complaint with the Stanley Parable is related to this problem, as I said before. I like to imagine that the game is commentating on the reception of Dear Esther in particular, as both games had similar development cycles, with the Stanley Parable releasing after Dear Esther each time, except more successfully. The Stanley Parable also considers an idea not often brought up in games, the concept that the only winning move for some games is not to play. There is one ending where a female narrator takes over to explain to Stanley/the player, right before their obvious death, that they can still make it out if they pause the game and quit. When playing games, the player makes a tacit agreement with the game that they will just pretend that no one is actually controlling the player. It's something every game has to do, not only to make the game more immersive, but for it to make sense at all. The female narrator specifically talks to the player the entire time that she exists, unlike the regular male narrator, who at least tries to put on a facade and struggles to keep the story going without breaking the fourth wall. This ending raises questions about how the concept of controlling another person is actually very odd, but like many other topics the game raises questions about, there exists only questions and jokes revolving around the subject, and no answers to be found. I'm incredibly glad that the Stanley Parable exists. Its remake does not add so much that I would tell someone that they must play the remake over the original mod, unless they really want a modern-looking game. There are still some visual hiccups here and there anyways, and the shadow textures aren't that great, but those are incredibly minor complaints in the grand scheme of things. The game does have a bunch of really unique ideas, like one of the endings being a museum where you can look around at various beta versions of the game. The narrator does a fantastic job as well, and he is given plenty of lines to keep the player's interest throughout the entire game. While I never personally laughed at anything that happened, I did exhale slightly through my nose several times. A lot of the jokes are not incredibly funny, but none of them fall completely flat. The intriguing, mysterious music is also sparse and minimalistic, but fitting for the tone. I hope to see more games from Galactic Cafe and/or David Redden in the future that discuss similar topics of meta-narrative in games, especially because the remake sold incredibly well, so whatever they make, it would probably be a sure success. And even though the Stanley Parable doesn't always go far enough with its topics and questions that it raises, it does a lot more than many pretentious indie games do. And it gets a pass because of its novelty, charm, and pure originality of its core gameplay concept.